Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into a world of candlelight stone corridors and courtly whispers. You're stepping into the medieval past, not as a nobleman or knight, but simply as an observer slipping through time like mist, invisible yet hyper-aware of every glint of a golden braid or rustle of velvet. All around you are women dressed for feasts and festivals, for sermons and serfs, each silently shaped by the beauty ideals of their time. Their faces are framed not just by wimples and veils, but by centuries of superstition, piety, poetry, and power. But here's your reality check. If you're thinking of runway-ready cheekbones or a glowing tan, you probably won't survive this trip. Because in medieval times, beauty wasn't about Instagram filters or skincare routines. It was about virtue, about visible signs of inner purity, and sometimes a bit of terrifying medical theory. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the outer courtyard of a medieval manor. The air thick with the smell of damp hay, firewood, and just a touch of rosewater. A small procession is moving through the garden, ladies in waiting, laughing gently under their breath, heads tilted under embroidered veils. You spot her immediately, the one who commands quiet attention. She's not loud, not proud, not dressed wildly differently, but the others glance at her constantly. You wonder why. She's pale, not in a sickly way, but in a porcelain-polished way. That's the first and most essential marker of beauty in this time. Fair skin doesn't just mean she's noble. It means she's untouched by the outdoor labor that tans and toughens. In medieval Europe, particularly in Christian regions, the paler the skin, the higher the status. A woman who could afford to stay indoors, who didn't bake bread in the sun, or dig roots in the field, was considered more refined and more desirable. Tans were for peasants. Complexions were a social ranking system worn right on the face. But don't confuse pale with plain. Her cheeks carry a subtle flush, a bloom that tells you she's alive, youthful, fertile. That flush might be natural, or it might be borrowed from crushed beetroot or wine sediment rubbed lightly into the skin. Cosmetics weren't exactly approved by the church, but vanity, as it turns out, is harder to outlaw than sin. Her forehead is surprisingly high. So high, in fact, that you notice something unusual. Her hairline seems unnaturally far back. That's because she's likely plucked it. Yes, really. Plucking the hairline was a common practice among upper-class women in the later Middle Ages, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries. A tall forehead was a mark of intelligence and elegance. Beauty manuals even recommended removing not just hair, but eyebrows entirely, or thinning them into faint lines. Her hair, what little of it you can see, is light, possibly blonde, or a soft auburn. Blonde hair was especially prized, often associated with angelic figures and purity. Women unable to naturally achieve it sometimes resorted to bleaching techniques using lye or sunlight mixed with herbal rinses. Of course, it was all done in private. A good lady wouldn't admit to it. But oh, how many of them tried. Her nose is long, narrow, straight, a noble shape in this era. Small noses were not the fashion. And her lips, soft, not too full, modest. The full-lipped sensuality prized in later eras was far too suggestive for a culture wrapped in religious symbolism. Her mouth must look capable of prayer, not seduction. Her clothing, too, emphasizes ideals. Her waist is drawn in tightly, though not unnaturally small. She doesn't aim for pain, just proportion. Her gowns are long, flowing, and layered. The way the fabric pools around her feet, gives her an ethereal quality, as if she floats rather than walks. That's intentional. Beauty in this time isn't about showing the body, but about cloaking it just right. Suggestion, not exposure. More than anything, though, what you notice is her demeanor. She glances down, often listens before she speaks, walks a step behind the older women, but ahead of the maids. In this world, a woman's beauty is inseparable from her behavior. Modesty is magnetic. A beautiful woman should seem humble, even invisible, until the moment she isn't. You realize something else as you watch her move a detail that reveals much more than her dress or complexion. When she's handed a posy of herbs, she holds it carefully in front of her chest and walks with it as if it's sacred. There's an entire language of posture here. Eyes low, hands folded back straight. This isn't just etiquette. It's allure. Of course, not everyone agrees on what's beautiful. In some regions, especially where classical ideals still linger from ancient Rome, you might see a preference for fuller bodies. Wealth meant food. Food meant curves. A woman with a round face, soft arms, and a hint of a belly might be seen as robust, healthy, blessed by God. And then there are the poets. You'll soon hear their verses drifting through castle halls and market corners. They don't write about waistlines or cheekbones. They write about grace. About skin so fair it reflects the moon. About hair like golden thread. About voices that sound like silver bells. Poetry exaggerates, but the fact that beauty is captured in verse means something deeper. It's not just about how a woman looks, but how she makes others feel. You step back into the shadows, watching her disappear through an arched doorway into the manor. You've only seen a few moments, but they tell you everything. Beauty in the medieval world was a performance, a script whispered down generations, shaped by faith, art, fear, and desire. And you're just getting started. You follow her through the stone archway into the manor's great hall, where torchlight flickers across tapestries of saints and legends. The floors are cold beneath your feet. Even in your imagination, this place carries a chill. Yet the warmth comes not from the hearth, but from the presence of these women gathered under a vaulted ceiling, their soft voices echoing like prayers. As your eyes adjust to the dim amber glow, you begin to notice more of them. Some sit at embroidery frames, others pore over psalters or simply sit still, as though stillness itself were a virtue. And in this room you realize something profound. Beauty wasn't a static trait in the Middle Ages. It wasn't simply what a woman looked like, but how she was shaped by the expectations around her. The church, the crown, the court, the community, each laid its chisel to her form. One of the women moves closer to the light, and you catch the curve of her cheek. She's not young, not old, perhaps just beyond the age considered marriageable. But her presence is striking. You remember that medieval beauty ideals were often tied to a woman's reproductive capacity. Fertility wasn't whispered about. It was part of the aesthetic. Rosy cheeks, plump hands, rounded hips, signs that a woman could bear children were subtly admired. They didn't say it outright, of course. That would be indecent. But the subtext, ever present. Her hands, like most of the women here, are dainty, well-kept. A beautiful woman wasn't expected to have calluses or cracked skin. Those were the marks of labor. A noble lady's hands were smooth, her nails manicured, sometimes tinted slightly with herbs, or even vinegar to appear more translucent. Pale hands meant you were above hard work. And again, beauty wasn't just seen. It was proven by the absence of toil. The room hums with quiet industry. Someone spills a handful of lavender on the floor, and the scent instantly wraps around you. That too was part of the aesthetic. A beautiful woman should smell lovely. Perfumed oils, herbal sachets tucked into sleeves or worn on a cord around the neck, even rose petals sewn into hemlines. Hygiene was erratic, but scent was symbolic. The body was sacred, but easily corrupted, so the beautiful woman masked earthly decay with divine fragrance. You catch sight of another woman now, this one younger, seated by the window. The daylight outlines the soft fuzz of hair on her upper lip. She notices and quickly ducks her head. That's another secret of medieval beauty concealment. Women used pumice stones, vinegar-soaked cloths, even razors to remove or thin unwanted hair. Smoothness implied youth, and youth was nearly everything. The ideal age for a beautiful woman in the medieval period was shockingly young by modern standards. A girl of 12 might be praised for her flowering beauty, her promise, her innocence. The moment of physical maturity was the peak before childbirth, aged the body before the sun had time to darken the skin, before gravity left its mark. Many young girls were married by their mid-teens, and in art, it's this fragile, transient moment that's immortalized. The bloom just before it fades. But beware, beauty had to be modest. To display it too boldly invited ruin. A woman too aware of her appearance, who flaunted it, painted her cheeks too red, smiled too freely. She risked being labeled a temptress, a Jezebel. The church warned of vanity, preached against cosmetics, and saw physical beauty as both a gift and a test. It was something to carry quietly, never wield like a weapon. You glance up at a tapestry hanging above the hearth, depicting the Virgin Mary in flowing robes, her hands open in humility. She is the ultimate beauty icon of the medieval world. Pale, delicate, wrapped in blue and white. Pure in body and soul. Her features aren't seductive, they're gentle, symmetrical, and composed. To look like Mary was to be considered beautiful, but more importantly, to behave like her was to earn admiration, meekness, obedience, grace. These were not just traits, they were aesthetic virtues. And yet beauty was not uniform across regions. In England and France, fairness and delicacy dominated. In the Iberian Peninsula, under Muslim influence, darker features, olive skin, almond eyes, glossy black hair, were also admired. There was cross-pollination even in ideals. What mattered was proportion, poise, and an alignment with divine symmetry. In the corner of the hall, an older woman begins to recite a poem. It's in Middle English, her voice lilting and full of breath. The lines describe a lady whose iron-like sapphires sheen and lippes reed as rose. Eyes like sapphires, lips red as roses. These metaphors crop up everywhere in love letters, in courtly songs, in stained glass. They weren't just compliments. They were codes. A beautiful woman wasn't described plainly. She was compared to rare stones, to flowers, to relics of heaven. It wasn't enough to say she was pretty. You had to say she was otherworldly. You look around and realize you're no longer noticing faces individually. You're absorbing the collective shape of beauty in this room. Quiet movements, unbroken eye contact, lowered lashes, the flick of a wrist, or the drop of a shoulder. It's theatrical and yet sincere. These women aren't acting. They've become their roles. Raised from birth to understand that beauty isn't just how they appear, it's how they exist in the world. As the candles burn lower and shadows lengthen on the walls, you step back toward the door. You've seen the surface, the skin, the garments, the gestures. But beauty runs deeper here. It's layered under piety and poetry, stitched into tapestries, prayed into being. It is as much about control as it is about charm. And you're still only brushing the edge. You drift from the manor's hall into a smaller chamber, quieter now, more intimate. The hush is almost sacred here, like the kind of silence found in a scriptorium or a cloister. This is where the noblewomen come to reflect, pray, and compose letters sealed with wax and careful intention. It's also where the truth of beauty becomes more nuanced, more layered than the painted depictions you've seen in books or murals. Here, beauty reveals itself not only in face or form, but in lineage, voice, and unexpectedly in silence. A young girl sits at the writing table, quill in hand, hair bound in a delicate braid that spills down her back like a rope of honeyed silk. She doesn't notice you, nor would she if you were truly here, but her presence anchors the room. You study her posture, the way she straightens her back, as if tethered to some invisible expectation. That posture, you realize, is part of what defines her allure. Grace isn't accidental, it's practiced. A woman who moves with elegance, who bows with precision, who folds her hands just so she is seen as beautiful, even if her features are unremarkable. Because here's a truth they don't teach in modern schools. In the medieval world, beauty was often less about what you were born with and more about how you performed it. Refinement was key, and refinement came from education. No, not formal schooling, at least not for most women. But the daughters of the nobility, those lucky few, were taught the subtleties of conversation, the art of speaking gently and listening well. A beautiful woman was expected to have a pleasant voice, one that didn't rise in harshness or volume. Her words were chosen carefully, delivered softly. Eloquence, even in a whisper, elevated her. A shrill voice or rough dialect could undo even the most flawless face. And when she wasn't speaking, she knew how to remain still. Stillness was not just ladylike, it was captivating. In a culture where chaos swirled outside the castle walls, famine, war, disease, a woman who radiated serenity was like a sanctuary. Her beauty was in her calm. You glance toward the window where another lady works her needle through velvet and linen. She's slightly older, more robust, her fingers nimble as they stitch a devotional scene into the fabric. Her cheeks are round, flushed from the warmth of the hearth. And here's something curious, she is beautiful too, though in a completely different way. You realize that medieval beauty wasn't one size fits all. While the poems sang of pale maids and golden curls, real admiration came in many forms. In rural villages, far from the courtly standards, a different kind of beauty flourished. There, a woman's sturdiness, her strong arms, her sun-kissed skin might be praised not in verse but in glances and proposals, in the pride of a harvest brought in. Function and beauty blurred. In some regions, especially among peasant communities, a healthy woman who could carry water, birth children, and survive a harsh winter was not only admired, she was essential. You're beginning to see a contrast now, a split along class lines. Noble beauty was curated, subtle, layered with symbols and status. Common beauty was practical, embodied in physical strength and resilience. But both were deeply rooted in the same thing, a woman's ability to fulfill her role, to reflect the values of her community through her body. And then there's the church. You pass by a carved wooden statue of a saint, Saint Agnes perhaps. Her face is serene eyes, downcast robes flowing. Religious beauty was the most dangerous kind of all. Because while it elevated women as divine vessels of virtue, it also imprisoned them in impossible standards. To be beautiful was to be pure, untouched, undefiled. The Virgin Mary again loomed as the model. But so did the martyrs, women who died rather than lose their chastity. A woman's body wasn't just hers. It belonged to her father's name, her husband's legacy, and God's plan. This is why throughout the Middle Ages, even beauty itself was often viewed with suspicion. A woman who was too beautiful might be a temptation, a threat, a gateway to sin. Monks wrote cautionary tales of maidens so lovely they caused men to forsake their vows. Beauty could invite the devil, and yet the same monks decorated their manuscripts with delicate female forms praising their elegance in the margins. A contradiction, of course. But that's what beauty was in this time a tightrope. Too little, and you were overlooked. Too much, and you were dangerous. Back in the chamber, a woman adjusts her veil. It's sheer, almost translucent, and it catches the light like morning mist. The way it drapes over her hair, partially obscuring her face, only makes her more mysterious. That's another lesson of the medieval aesthetic: concealment enhances desire. Unlike today's overt displays, medieval beauty thrived on hints and veils, on glimpses and suggestions. A flash of wrist, the curve of a throat. These were potent symbols. Modesty wasn't just a virtue. It was a kind of visual poetry. The colors of her garments also matter. Blue and white symbols of purity and heavenly grace were considered ideal for noble women. Red could signal passion or wealth, but also vanity. Green, fertility. Black, humility or mourning. What you wore wasn't merely fashion. It was code. Even your scent was chosen carefully. Lavender for calm. Myrrh for mystery. Rose for virtue. And sometimes frankincense lifted straight from the altars of the church to the wrists of a woman preparing for a feast. You sit beside the fire now, taking it all in. The quiet gestures, the faint scents, the flicker of a half-hidden face. You begin to understand that beauty in this world isn't bold. It whispers. It's tucked into rituals, into posture, into the patient flick of a needle. It doesn't demand to be seen. It waits to be noticed. The fire in the chamber has burned low, and the air carries the faint scent of beeswax and drying herbs. You drift from the manor house and find yourself walking through the stone cloisters of a convent. It's here in this quiet world of devotion and simplicity that you encounter another expression of medieval beauty that has nothing to do with lavish gowns or noble lineage, but everything to do with the soul. The nun kneeling before the altar is young, no older than 16. Her face is calm, framed by the starched linen of her wimple, her eyes closed in silent prayer. There is no jewelry here, no rouge or perfume, and yet there's something hauntingly beautiful about her stillness. You realize that for centuries, spiritual beauty was held above all others. To be seen as beautiful in the eyes of God, that was the highest form of grace. In many ways, this spiritual ideal was aspirational, even for women outside the convent walls. Laywomen were often encouraged to emulate nuns in conduct, humility, and self-presentation. Modesty wasn't just a fashion, it was a moral imperative. A beautiful woman, truly beautiful, was thought to be inwardly chaste and outwardly composed. Her skin should be pale, yes, but not glowing from pleasure. It should be pale like moonlight, like cloistered calm untouched by vanity or lust. You sit near the fountain in the convent courtyard, where water drips softly over stone. A group of novices passes by, each draped in plain habits, their heads bowed. You realize something radical even here among women who have renounced the world. Beauty is still a presence. Not because anyone tries to achieve it, but because beauty was believed to flow naturally from virtue. A holy woman was radiant, not with makeup or gold, but with grace. And in many texts, that radiance was described in aesthetic terms: glowing skin, luminous eyes, a softness of form. The soul made visible. But outside the monastery walls, beauty had to walk a far narrower path. You step back into the outer world now, to a bustling market town, where the standards shift again, earthier, more localized. The baker's wife is wide-hipped and broad-shouldered, with flour on her cheeks, and arms strong from kneading. And still she is considered lovely by her husband, by her neighbors, by the men who linger a little too long at her stall. In these communities, a woman's usefulness could enhance her beauty. Her ability to nourish, to endure, to carry on through hardship, these traits were respected, even admired. In rural life, strength was beautiful. Still, even here, ideals from the upper classes trickled down. Young girls braided their hair with ribbons, scrubbed their faces with vinegar or buttermilk, and wore their Sunday smocks just a bit tighter when the local fair came to town. They mimicked the nobles as best they could, dreaming of pale skin, dainty hands, fine linens. Because beauty, even in its purest form, was a kind of social currency. In towns and cities, apprentices wrote poems to girls they spotted in church or in passing on the bridge. These poems praised the curve of a neck, the shimmer of a braid, the softness of a gaze. Even the working classes engaged in the art of admiration. Love letters were penned, verses exchanged, and modest gifts, dried flowers, carved wooden combs were shyly offered. Beauty might not have been the same for everyone, but it was still a language that everyone across classes longed to speak. You find yourself now inside a small chapel tucked away beside the town square. A wedding is being prepared. The bride is seated quietly, surrounded by women adjusting her veil. She is not the fairest woman you've seen tonight, not the most delicate, not the most refined, but there's a light in her eyes that draws the room toward her. The older women fuss gently over her, whispering prayers for a good marriage, for healthy children, for peace. You watch as she turns her face slightly toward the altar, and in that moment, you understand something deeply medieval. Beauty is as much about hope as it is about appearance. She is beautiful because this day changes her life, because she is stepping into a role so old and revered that it carries its own glow. In this society, a bride is temporarily idealized, wrapped in cloth of gold if she's wealthy, or linen and lace if she's not. But either way, she is presented as the best version of herself. She becomes an icon for a moment, an image of possibility. The ceremony hasn't begun yet, but already the guests are arriving, some whispering about how lucky the groom is, others about the sweetness of the girl's smile. A few glance skeptically at her figure or her complexion, because even in these sacred moments, judgment never quite disappears, but she doesn't notice. Or maybe she does and chooses grace anyway. You're struck by the resilience in that. Medieval women lived under constant scrutiny, not just from men, but from one another, from their priests, from the community itself. And yet they managed to cultivate beauty in small ways. A sprig of rosemary in the hair, a smile held just a beat too long, a song hummed at dusk. These quiet acts were their resistance, their poetry. And while many ideals were rigid, imposed from pulpits and court chambers, women themselves were often the ones who kept beauty alive, who passed down remedies and rituals, who stitched it into linens and whispered it into lullabies. You step out into the twilight again, the sky streaked with violet and ash. Lamps are being lit. Somewhere nearby, someone sings a low, slow song in a dialect you don't recognize, but the feeling is unmistakable. Longing, devotion, memory. And as you walk back toward the manor, you begin to sense the deeper truth in medieval times. A beautiful woman wasn't just born. She was imagined, shaped, and remembered. And somewhere, whether in a poem, a prayer, or a painting, she is still being dreamed into existence. The night deepens around the manor as you return, walking slowly beneath the canopy of stars. The village beyond has quieted, save for a distant dog's bark and the faint toll of a church bell marking the hour. The world is still now, and you find yourself slipping once more into the great hall, where the fire's embers glow red and shadows dance across the stone walls. Beauty, it seems, does not sleep, not in this time. It lingers in the air like incense, waiting to be witnessed, remembered, or perhaps misunderstood. You notice a change in the room. The younger women have retired, and now seated near the hearth are the matrons, older women, some gray at the temples, others with faces that speak of long winters and harder truths. And still, there is a certain reverence in the way they carry themselves. In the folds of their gowns, the steel in their posture, the way they smooth their skirts or glance knowingly across the room. Beauty in youth may be prized, but here you see something more complex, enduring beauty. A beauty shaped not by freshness, but by memory and reputation. In the medieval world, this too mattered deeply. A woman's beauty was not just in her face or figure, but in her virtue, her name, her legacy. A noble woman who had carried herself with grace through marriage, childbirth, grief, and duty became beautiful through endurance. Her beauty was no longer soft or dewy. It was etched into her like script on vellum. Lines on the face were not shameful. They were marks of dignity, the ability to suffer and remain composed that was admired. That was powerful. One of the older women laughs gently, soft, but rich like old wine, and the younger ones glance over, listening. You realize that she perhaps once described in courtly songs or whispered about behind fans now commands a different kind of attention. Her beauty no longer needs confirmation. It is known, worn like a cloak that cannot be taken from her. You turn your gaze to the far wall where a set of illuminated manuscripts sits on a shelf open for reading. Their pages glimmer with gold leaf and blue pigments, each line a delicate marriage of language and image. You lean in and read part of a passage. It's from a medieval bestiary. The text speaks of mythical animals, unicorns, phoenixes, dragons. But in the margin, nestled like a secret, is the figure of a woman. Her hair is curled like vines, her gown woven with lilies. She is not a real figure. She is an ideal. That's when it strikes you. The most beautiful women in medieval times were often not women at all, but symbols. Constructed, idealized, fictionalized. They lived in songs and tapestries on stained glass and scrolls. They were embodiments of values, chastity, patience, gentleness. Even in literature, these women existed to inspire longing, not to be fully known. They were praised for their quiet, their absence, their untouchability, and yet, actual women read these stories. They embroidered these faces. They internalized these ideals and tried in small ways to become them. You picture a young girl reading a tale of courtly love by candlelight, then examining her own reflection in a brass mirror, wondering if she too could be compared to a rose or a swan, wondering if her chin was delicate enough, her brow high enough, her lashes long enough. The standard was set in fantasy, but real women bore the weight of it. You think of the myth of Iseult of Guinevere, of Elaine of Astolat, the fair maid of Astolat, who dies of unrequited love. Her body floated downriver in a barge adorned with flowers. These were not just stories, they were templates. To be beautiful meant to be worthy of being mourned, sung about, remembered through tragedy. And often that meant being passive even to the point of death. Of course, not all women agreed with this vision. Some rebelled quietly. A well-placed joke, a flash of ankle, a refusal to marry, a stubborn preference for riding astride instead of side saddle. In the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine or Christine de Pisan's writing circles, a different kind of beauty emerged, one that made room for intellect, for wit, for agency. But these were exceptions, rare lights in a world otherwise governed by strict codes. You pause near the window, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard. The silver light spills across the flagstones, catching the hem of a discarded veil. You imagine the woman who wore it. Was she leaving a feast? Slipping into the garden for a moment of quiet? Or had she removed it deliberately, casting off a symbol of modesty just for a breath of freedom? That too was beauty. The stolen moment. The human behind the icon. The glance that didn't lower quickly enough. The song sung too loud. The hand that lingered on another's sleeve. In the silence, you begin to understand that medieval beauty lived in tension, between heaven and earth, between obedience and individuality, between the living body and the painted image. It was both a burden and a privilege. To be beautiful could open doors or seal a fate. The embers crackle behind you, and the room feels heavier now, richer somehow. As if the very walls remember every woman who walked this space, every daughter, mother, widow, bride. Their beauty wasn't one thing. It wasn't just their eyes or skin, was or hair. It was how they endured, how they hoped, how they learned to be seen without speaking, and sometimes, how they spoke anyway. And in that quiet act, they shaped history far more deeply than any mirror ever could. You awaken before dawn, though you never really slept. Not in this place, not in this time. The manor is hushed, its stone corridors bathed in the softest gray light, the kind that makes everything feel slightly unreal, like you've stepped into a painting before the colors have been filled in. You wander toward the stables, toward the kitchens, toward the spaces where servants stir before sunrise. And here, among the rustle of skirts and the clatter of wooden pails, you encounter a different kind of beauty, quiet, humble, and entirely overlooked. The scullery maid scrubs a wooden floor, her hair tied back, strands already escaping in damp curls along her neck. Her skin is ruddy from the cold morning air, her nails stained with ash. She doesn't fit the poetry, not the kind sung in courtly halls. No troubadour will pen sonnets to her hands, nor will monks illuminate her likeness in the margins of holy books. And yet, there's something arresting about her. She laughs at a joke whispered by another servant girl, and in that split second, the entire room seems to brighten. It's not a beauty born of status or symmetry, it's one born of warmth, realness. It isn't adorned. It simply is. In medieval times, this kind of beauty was rarely celebrated in public, but it thrived in private, in kitchens, in gardens, in the rare glances exchanged behind tapestries. The peasant girl or the serving maid may not have matched the elite standards, but that didn't mean she went unnoticed. Her charm might be described with different words, lively, rosy, sweet-faced. Her value was in her cheer, her health, her ability to bring comfort in hard times. She was the embodiment of earth and effort of survival. In contrast, you now pass through the manor's chapel, where a noblewoman kneels alone, her face lifted toward the high altar as the first sunbeam splits through the stained glass. Her gown is sky blue, her veil like spun silver, and the light wraps around her like a blessing. She's beautiful in the traditional sense, sculpted almost otherworldly, but as you watch her lips move in silent prayer, it becomes clear that her beauty too is tethered to context. In this space among incense and relics, a woman's beauty is meant to reflect heaven, not earth. Her every gesture is symbolic. Her clasped hands are not simply pious, they're poised. Her bowed head is not just devout, it's elegant. Even her breath seems choreographed. You begin to realize that medieval beauty was often constructed, curated like a tableau. Women didn't just look beautiful. They had to become beauty, embody it like a vocation. You slip into the cloister garden where dew clings to the petals of a dozen herbal plants. Rosemary, thyme, sage. A young woman is gathering leaves into a woven basket. She is neither noble nor servant, but something in between a healer's apprentice, perhaps, or the daughter of a merchant. Her sleeves are rolled to the elbow, revealing arms strong from work, but her movements are precise, reverent. She hums as she works, and her voice, though soft, is sure. She's beautiful in a way that would have confused the chroniclers, not because of paleness or silence or divine symmetry, but because of competence, because of peace. She knows what she's doing. She knows who she is, and you remember for all the ideals preached from pulpits and painted in chapels, real medieval life was full of contradictions. The woman who bore children without complaint, who buried husbands and kept going, who stitched wounds or fed the poor. She may not have fit the ideal, but she was honored nonetheless. Her beauty was whispered about, never written down, passed from neighbor to neighbor, known only by those who needed her. You return now to the upper halls where a tapestry is being unrolled by two attendants. It's newly woven, its threads still catching bits of sunlight like glass. It tells the story of a legendary lady, her body impossibly slender, her hair coiled into halos, her face expressionless but serene. This is the image that gets remembered. This is what survives. The idealized woman, the imagined one. And yet you know now that beauty was never so narrow. The real women, the ones who bled and sang and worked and aged, they didn't live on cloth or parchment. But they lived. Their beauty was ephemeral but real. Spoken in kitchens, glimpsed in gardens, felt in the hush before prayers, or the rise of laughter at dusk. You pause at the window as the sun finally crests the eastern fields. Everything below you glows gold, the rooftops, the dirt paths, the women moving through them, like figures in a dream. Some are stooped with baskets. Others walk with dignity. Others pause to hush crying children. And each in her own way is a portrait. Not painted, not preserved, but beautiful just the same. In the end, medieval beauty wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 small things. A glance, a gesture, a song, a silence, and most of all, a presence. You feel it now like a warmth behind your ribs. You were never really watching just faces. You were watching stories. The village is wide awake now. Smoke rises from chimney pots, and the manor's outer gate creaks open as carts roll in laden with hay vegetables and bundles of cloth. You move with the morning rhythm, passing between kitchen boys and milkmaids, catching glimpses of lace-trimmed sleeves, kerchiefs tied neatly at the nape, and cheeks still flushed from sleep. Beauty in the fresh light of day feels less mysterious and more lived in. And yet everywhere you turn, it hums beneath the surface. You find yourself walking beside a young noblewoman preparing to ride. Her lady's maid fastens her cloak, brushing away invisible specks of dust. The noblewoman is tall, straight-backed, her hair braided beneath a crisp linen coif. There is a precision to her, as though she has been trained not merely in etiquette, but in how to move through the world as a symbol. Because that's what women of her class were taught from the beginning, how to carry beauty like a crown. Not to flaunt it, but to maintain it, to preserve it, to reflect the values of their house with every glance and curtsy. She was likely trained to speak 3 languages, to play the lute, to walk, without letting her heels thud against the stone. Grace was a craft, and beauty for someone like her was a duty. You watch as she mounts her horse carefully assisted and rides toward the forest path with 2 companions. Her cloak fans out behind her, and the silver clasps glint in the sun. You realize that for noble women, even physical activities were staged with aesthetics in mind. Hunting, hawking, riding, these weren't just pastimes, they were social performances, and part of a beautiful woman's allure came from how well she could participate in them without losing her poise. Not far off, you hear the laughter of young peasant girls gathering berries along the fence line. Their dresses are simple, stained at the hems, but their joy is infectious. One tucks a wildflower behind her ear and giggles when her sister pretends to curtsy. There is no embroidery, no perfume, but there's something radiant in their freedom. This is a different kind of beauty, uncontained, unpolished, completely unpretentious. For a moment you reflect on how little control most women had over their own appearances. In the Middle Ages, mirrors were rare and glass ones even rarer still. Most women saw themselves in polished metal in still water, or in the comments of others. To know how you looked was often to hear it secondhand, filtered through someone else's gaze, someone else's judgment. A young woman might not know if she had decent features until an elder remarked that she resembled her mother, or until her father arranged a betrothal based on her marriageable qualities. Beauty, then, was not just appearance, it was also perception. A social verdict handed down through whispers and glances. You pass a merchant's daughter arranging bolts of fabric in her father's stall. Her dress is finer than most cobalt blue wool, a brooch in the shape of a tiny bird pinned at the shoulder. She stands straighter than the other girls, more aware of the eyes upon her. Her hair is pinned into intricate loops, and you wonder how long she sat still for that arrangement. She's beautiful, yes, but more than that, she's trying to be beautiful. And here lies another truth effort mattered. While modern sensibilities often prize the natural look, medieval beauty required maintenance. Creams made from almond oil or animal fat, ointments mixed with honey, and ash herbal rinses for the skin. There were even tooth powders made from crushed charcoal and salt meant to brighten a smile. But these rituals weren't talked about openly. Admitting to them risked seeming vain. Women were expected to appear effortlessly lovely, even if it meant hours of quiet labor. Beauty was meant to look natural, but it was never accidental. You turn into a smaller alley near the town's edge and find an old woman weaving at her loom. Her face is lined, but her eyes are piercing, and her hands move with the ease of decades. She hums a tune you can't quite place, one of those ancient melodies that seem older than memory. She was once a bride, perhaps once the village's beauty, and now she is something rarer, revered. In some communities, the beauty of age was acknowledged, even cherished. The crone, the wise woman, the midwife, these figures were feared and respected in equal measure. They held knowledge of herbs, of childbirth, of fate. Their beauty was not romantic, not soft, but it had weight. You step back into the manor grounds where the noon bells begin to chime. You've seen women of every rank now, noble and poor, young and old, shy and bold, and the picture is no longer simple. Beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't a single face or a single body. It was an atmosphere, a performance, a negotiation. Each woman you've watched today navigates that performance differently. Some lean into it, composed, graceful, practiced. Others resist it, laughing too loudly, wearing color, when others would whisper. But all of them in some way are affected by the quiet rules of this world. You sit on the edge of a stone well and breathe in the air rich with bread smoke and lavender. And you wonder, if you lived in this time, how would you be seen? Would your face be praised in song? Or would your value be measured in other ways, in loyalty? In hands that don't tremble in the way your presence calms a room? Because here's the secret you've been uncovering all along. Beauty wasn't just about being admired. It was about being remembered. The heat of the afternoon settles gently across the manor grounds, casting everything in a warm, golden haze. Birds flit through ivy-covered archways, and the hum of insects thickens in the air. You find yourself moving toward the orchard, where sunlight filters through gnarled branches heavy with fruit. Beneath one of the trees, a girl sits weaving wildflowers into a garland. Her dress is plain, her shoes dusty, but the light catches her hair just so, and for a moment, she could be a painting. And perhaps one day she will be. Because in the medieval world, beauty wasn't just captured in mirrors or in whispered compliments. It was immortalized in art. Illuminated manuscripts, altar panels, tapestries, and sculpture all bore the likenesses of idealized women. But here's the twist: those women didn't always exist. They were inventions shaped to fit theology legend or courtly desire. You step closer to the manor's chapel and notice the stained glass window glowing like a jewel. In it, a saint gazes down with almond-shaped eyes and cascading golden hair. She wears a robe of celestial blue and cradles a lily. This woman is impossibly serene, flawless, distant, pure. She's not meant to be real. She's meant to inspire. In medieval iconography, this kind of beauty conveyed virtue, not individuality. If you looked like a saint, you were more likely to be one in the eyes of others. Appearance and morality were intertwined. But real women rarely matched these images. Most never saw themselves reflected in art, unless they were royal patrons or subjects of scandal. Even queens were often idealized beyond recognition, their portraits altered to emphasize piety, not personality. You could be powerful, yes, but you had to be beautiful in a particular way, submissive, divine, unthreatening. And yet art was not the only place where beauty was defined. It lived in language too, in the songs of troubadours, in the ballads sung in castle gardens, in the riddles and rhymes passed from mother to daughter. These poems praised women not just for how they looked, but for how they walked, how they smiled, how they rejected a suitor with grace. Every movement, every glance was a line of verse waiting to be composed. You walk now along a garden path where a pair of young women are practicing a court dance. Their steps are measured, their skirts swishing softly as they twirl in rhythm. One laughs when she stumbles, but quickly catches herself and resumes the choreography. You can see the concentration in her brow, the silent hope in her eyes. She knows this isn't just a dance, it's a display. These movements, delicate, deliberate, are part of how she will be judged, because in noble circles, beauty extended far beyond the physical. It was how you moved through space, how you occupied silence, how you waited. A beautiful woman knew not to speak unless spoken to, not to eat too quickly, not to meet a man's eyes for too long. Even the act of sitting had rules: never slouch, never spread, always fold your hands in your lap. Manners were beauty made visible. But even in this polished world, cracks appeared. You overhear one girl whispering about her cousin who married a merchant and now wears red gowns and sings loudly in public. Too bold, she says, with a note of admiration hidden beneath the judgment. That's the thing about ideals, they don't always match desire. The rules say one thing, but hearts often want another. Forbidden love, unapproved liaisons, sudden glances across feast tables, these moments remind you that even in a world obsessed with order, beauty could be unruly. You pause near a stone bench where a woman in her 30s sits with a book in her lap. She reads slowly, her finger following the lines. You sense from her dress that she's not noble, perhaps the educated wife of a steward or a literate widow. Her beauty is quiet, but you feel it strongly. It's in her focus, her stillness, her refusal to shrink in the presence of others. This was another kind of medieval beauty, intellectual, rare, slightly subversive. Literacy among women was uncommon, but not unheard of. And women who could read, especially if they read Latin or French, were often regarded with a mix of awe and caution. A clever woman could be a blessing or a threat. A beautiful woman who was also wise. She lived under double scrutiny, and yet many found ways to cultivate both. In noble households, girls were taught to recite prayers, copy psalms, and read stories of saints and martyrs. Beauty wasn't just worn, it was spoken, read, sung. It was knowledge woven into femininity, carefully balanced so as not to tip into arrogance. Even a woman's handwriting could be judged. Slanted, even letters, graceful. Sloppy script, unrefined. In a world where so little was yours, where property choice and freedom were limited, a lovely hand could leave a powerful mark. It was a legacy in ink. You wander toward the kitchens again as the evening shadows begin to stretch. There, the cook's daughter offers a stranger a piece of warm bread. The man smiles, surprised by her kindness, and she blushes, brushing a loose curl from her face. That simple moment, that combination of generosity, softness, and timidity, is its own small portrait of beauty. And you realize something. In every space you've entered today, chapel, garden, hall, stable beauty has been less about the face and more about the effect. How a woman made others feel. How she moved through her world with awareness. How she was observed, remembered, idealized, or quietly cherished. The women themselves didn't always get to define it. They didn't always have a choice. But within those confines, they still found moments of power, of individuality, of radiance. And somewhere in the spaces between the expectations, between the gazes and the judgments, they created something enduring, something entirely their own. As dusk draws near, once again, the manor glows with the flicker of candles. Shadows stretch long against the worn stone, and the air turns cool with the first breath of evening. You find yourself wandering through a quiet gallery, a corridor of portraits, tapestries, and wooden chests, carved with family crests. The scent of old linen and lavender oil lingers here, and every object whispers a memory. This is where legacies are stored. And among them the legacy of beauty endures like a haunting melody. You stop before a large oil painting, faded, cracked with age, yet still radiant in its detail. A noble woman stares back at you, stiff-backed and solemn, with a thin face and dark almond-shaped eyes. She wears a headdress that hides her hair completely, as was the fashion in certain courts. Her hands are folded demurely across her waist, and in her left, she holds a sprig of rosemary, symbol of remembrance. Her beauty isn't dramatic. It's ceremonial, measured. But you can tell this was once a face others studied, compared themselves to, maybe even feared. Because beauty wasn't always soft. In some courts especially, those influenced by political intrigue, beauty was a weapon, a tool. A beautiful woman could be sent to another kingdom as a diplomatic bride, her body a living treaty. She might be expected to charm, to yield, to produce heirs. And her worth would be judged not only by her fertility or appearance, but by her effectiveness. Did she please her husband? Did she survive childbirth? Did she secure alliances? The pressure was immense. And many women, noble women especially, knew that their future could rise or fall on the strength of their beauty alone. They studied it like warcraft. They learned how to paint their lips with crushed berries, how to smooth their brows, how to tilt their heads just enough to appear modest without seeming weak. They were never just seen, they were evaluated, constantly. But power cuts both ways. You recall the stories of women who flipped the script, who used their beauty to bend fate. Women like Isabeau of Bavaria, whose presence dominated the French court. Or Agnes Sorel, the famously lovely mistress of Charles VII, who influenced royal policy from the shadows. These women were not merely beautiful. They were visible. And in being visible, they claimed a kind of authority. Of course, that visibility came with risk. A woman too beautiful, too influential, too clever. She might be praised one day and condemned the next. Accusations of sorcery were never far off. The same charm that once captivated a king could later be twisted into evidence of witchcraft. It was a delicate line to walk between allure and threat. You pass another portrait now, one much smaller, tucked away in the corner. The subject is less refined, her posture more natural. She gazes directly outward, not down, not to the side, but at you. There's a trace of defiance in her expression, the kind that doesn't fit easily into any doctrine of ideal beauty. You wonder who she was. A merchant's daughter, a poet's muse. A woman who insisted on being painted as she truly looked. And that raises another point. The beauty ideals of the time may have been rigid, but women weren't passive recipients. They adapted. They pushed back. They played the game and sometimes rewrote the rules. They chose when to display themselves and when to hide. They found ways to subvert the gaze, even if only in private. Even if only in the way they told their stories to their daughters, because storytelling too was a vessel for beauty. Around hearths over embroidery frames during births and funerals, women passed along tales not just of saints and princesses, but of real women who dared, who endured, who surprised. These stories didn't always survive in parchment, but they did in spirit. You exit the gallery now, and step into a smaller sitting room where a trio of women, mother, daughter, and aunt, are seated near a low fire. The eldest is darning a stocking. The mother is plaiting the daughter's hair slowly, gently. They aren't speaking, but there's a closeness here, a warmth that feels more intimate than words. The girl's face is unremarkable by conventional standards, freckles a nose, slightly off-center, unruly eyebrows. But she's radiant in her comfort, in her belonging. This is what beauty looked like before mirrors, before judgment. Just a girl in a circle of women who love her. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that beauty in medieval times was also communal. It wasn't just about admiration. It was about connection. How a woman was regarded by her family, how she moved within her community, how she was mourned when she passed. The most beautiful women were not always the ones in the poems. Sometimes they were the ones whose bread was missed most when they died, whose laughter still echoed in the corners of a home, whose hands had held so many others through cold nights and childbirth and grief. You stand in the doorway watching them a moment longer, then slip back into the hall. The evening is closing in now. Torches are being lit. The manor settles into quiet rituals, rosaries recited, shutters drawn, dogs curling beneath benches. And you understand that beauty, for all its shifting forms and cultural trappings, was always more than surface. It was legacy. The impressions women left on each other. The marks they made without ever trying. The way they were felt long after they were gone. The stars are just beginning to pierce the velvet sky as you step into the herb garden. It's cooler here now, and the scent of sage and mint rises with the evening dew. Crickets hum somewhere beyond the hedges. You pause, breathing in the quiet, and realize that here in this gentle, enclosed space, you're closer than ever to understanding what beauty truly meant to medieval women. Not the version preserved in paint or chiseled in marble, but the one passed quietly from hand to hand, from season to season. Kneeling near the thyme bushes is a midwife, perhaps in her 40s, gathering leaves by touch rather than sight. Her fingers are practiced, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her apron still dusted with flour and soot. No one would write poems about her. She doesn't have golden hair or porcelain skin, but her presence radiates something undeniable: competence, care, wisdom. And in this moment you begin to see that beauty for many women was bound to usefulness, to trust, to how many people felt safe in their arms. This kind of beauty was unspoken, rarely acknowledged in courtly songs or tapestries. It lived in the kitchens, the birthing chambers, the deathbeds. It was the beauty of women who knew how to braid hair, stop bleeding, ease fever. Women who remembered stories and names and who never stopped working even when the world wasn't watching. You follow the path toward the dovecote, where a servant girl hums a lullaby while scattering seed. Her voice is thin but clear like wind through reeds. She has no audience but the birds. Still, she sings. In a culture where women were told to lower their voices, to defer, to let men speak first, this song is an act of quiet defiance. Her beauty, you realize, is not in her features, but in her presence. In the way she fills this empty space with something gentle, something alive. And here is another truth: medieval beauty was always in tension with silence. To be beautiful was to be admired, yes, but not to speak too boldly. To be graceful, but not opinionated. To be seen, but never commanding. Yet within these strictures, women found ways to express themselves through song, through stitching, through gesture and ritual. They created beauty through creation itself. A carefully embroidered tunic, a garden planted in perfect rows, a wedding loaf baked with herbs for luck. You enter the weaving room again, where looms clatter softly under candlelight. Women work in pairs, one guiding the shuttle, the other tightening threads. Their conversation is low and rhythmic, filled with names, with worries, with little jokes. This is a sacred space, too, in its own way. And it reveals something else: beauty was also communal. It wasn't always about the face in the mirror. Sometimes it was the collective effort, the tapestry no one could make, alone the song that needed harmonies, the dance that required steps in time. In noble households, young girls would often learn these skills not just for utility, but for identity. A girl who embroidered well was said to be refined. A girl who sang with the right tone, not too loudly, not too boldly, was praised. Even laughter had a standard. It shouldn't shriek or cackle. A beautiful woman's laughter, they said, sounded like silver bells. But behind these standards lay women who bent them, who laughed too freely, who hummed when they worked, who stitched secret initials into altar cloths, or tucked herbs into pillows to ward off nightmares. These women weren't always praised, but they were remembered. You move now toward the private chambers of the lady of the manor. Her room is quiet, but not empty. She sits at her mirror, a polished metal disc, and dabs her temples with rosewater. Her maid brushes her hair in long strokes, whispering about tomorrow's guests, the new fabrics from Flanders, the color blue now worn at court. The lady listens, nodding. She's middle-aged now, her face marked with time. But there is poise in her posture. Her beauty hasn't faded, it's simply changed, matured. Because in the medieval world, beauty did not entirely vanish with youth. If a woman carried herself with dignity, if she ruled her household well, if she became a respected mother or widow, her beauty became something else: reputation. It outlived skin. It outlasted fashion. You remember now how many forms beauty has taken throughout this journey: the untouched innocence of a cloistered girl, the laughing freedom of peasant sisters, the ceremonial elegance of a noble bride, the fierce serenity of an aging midwife. None of them match perfectly, and yet all of them counted. Sometimes quietly, sometimes fiercely, always with more depth than any manuscript ever recorded. You sit now on a low stone bench near the rose bushes. The petals have begun to fall soft and bruised against the earth. A girl passes by, sweeping them into a basket. She looks at you and smiles not because she must, but because she wants to. And in that unremarkable, spontaneous gesture, you see beauty again. Unposed, unstaged, unwritten. It's in the choice. And now you realize medieval beauty was never just what the world saw. It was what a woman chose to reveal, to conceal, to nurture, or to defy. It was shaped by culture, yes, by class and church and tradition, but at its core, it lived in her. Not just on her face, but in the way she moved, the way she gave, the way she was remembered. And you've only just begun to know her. The moon is high now, casting a silver glow over the manor rooftops, the chapel spire, and the quiet fields beyond. Everything feels slowed, softened, like time itself has paused to breathe. You find yourself walking along the outer wall, just beyond the herb garden, where the stones are warm from the day's sun and cool from the night's breeze. In the hush of this hour, beauty feels different again, less ceremonial, less performative. Now it's something deeper, something closer to truth. You pass a girl sitting alone on the stone ledge, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes turned skyward. Her dress is simple, her hair undone, falling loose around her shoulders. She hums something wordless, a tune only she knows, and you realize this is beauty stripped bare. No embroidery, no posture, no gaze to please, just a human being at rest. And perhaps this, above all, was the rarest kind of medieval beauty privacy. Because in a time where women were always being watched by their fathers, by their husbands, by their parish priests and fellow villagers, a moment like this was precious. To exist without scrutiny, without expectation, to be beautiful only to oneself. But this freedom was limited. For most women, every part of life was shaped by the need to conform, to customs, to hierarchy, to the endless tangle of expectations placed on their bodies and minds. Whether in a castle or a cottage, beauty was rarely just for pleasure. It was a social function. It spoke of your class, your morality, your marriageability, even your destiny. You step now into the solar, the manor's private family room used for reading, sewing, and quiet talk. A fire burns low, and a young woman sits at the window spinning flax into fine thread. She works steadily, skillfully, and beside her, her mother leans over a letter, whispering the words aloud as she practices her reading. This is a different kind of legacy, the inheritance not of wealth, but of knowledge, of skills passed from woman to woman. How to spin, how to mend, how to tend to wounds, to mix herbs, to soothe a crying child, to prepare for winter. These too were measures of a woman's value, and in them lived a form of beauty not captured in portraits, but in memory. A daughter remembered her mother's hands, the way she braided her hair, the way she smelled of thyme and smoke and milk soap, the way she sang low while sweeping. These details didn't appear in books or ballads, but they stayed. They endured. You move down a hallway hung with a tapestry mid-completion. The thread shimmers gold and crimson, forming the image of a woman seated in a garden surrounded by animals. It's one of the Lady and the Unicorn series, allegorical, symbolic, saturated with ideals. Each panel represents a different sense, taste, hearing, sight, touch, smell. And the last simply labeled, "À mon seul désir," to my only desire. That final image has sparked debate for centuries. Is the woman renouncing passion, choosing virtue, or is she for the first time choosing herself, her own desire? Because even in a world that prized obedience, women weren't without inner lives. They had preferences, feelings, fantasies, and sometimes beauty was shaped not by the eyes that looked at them, but by how they looked back. The choices they made in the quiet. Who to love, who to avoid. When to smile, when to stay silent. In that way, beauty became a language only some could read. A glance held too long, a brooch worn a little too low, a certain flower tucked behind the ear. For women with little freedom, these were acts of subtle rebellion, or flirtation, or even grief. Beauty was always double-edged. A performance, yes, but also sometimes a message. You remember then how much pressure medieval women lived under, how easily admiration could turn to suspicion, how quickly beauty could become accusation. The prettier the face, the more closely it was watched, the more it had to prove, and the less room it had to falter. Witch hunts, scolds' bridals, gossip, judgment. Beauty was not always a blessing. Sometimes it was a burden, and those who carried it learned to be careful, to be strategic, or to hide it when they could. And yet some still chose to shine, to wear the red ribbon, to dance a little longer, to meet a stranger's gaze without apology. They may not have been recorded in the history books, but their choices echo still. You sit now near the chapel once more. The stars have multiplied, wheeling silently above. The manor sleeps, but the memory of every woman you've seen tonight lingers flickering like the last candle in the hall. Not just the saintly ones or the noble ones or the painted ones. All of them. The seamstress with clever fingers, the girl who sang to herself, the mother who taught without words, the bride who dared to smile too wide, the widow who refused to fade. Each left a trace, and in their traces you've begun to see the truth. Medieval beauty was not one thing. It was a constellation, fleeting, infinite. Illuminated not by light, but by presence. The night is thick now, velvet and endless. You walk slowly through the quiet cloisters, the hush of the stones beneath your feet almost holy. Somewhere in the distance an owl calls. The manor has fallen entirely into sleep. Fires have been banked, candles extinguished. But the air still pulses with memory, with impressions left behind by all the women you've encountered in this journey. You slip through a wooden door into the scriptorium, a place typically reserved for monks and scribes, but this one, rare for the time, has been gifted to a noblewoman known for her piety and learning. Her family, it's said, prizes wisdom as well as beauty. A single lamp burns near the writing desk, casting a soft cone of gold over the parchment. And seated there is a woman writing, not copying scripture, not a husband's ledger, but something of her own. You lean close and see it's a prayer, but one not written in Latin, but in her own language, Middle English, personal, unfiltered. You read a line aloud in your head, "Let me be worthy not for their eyes, but thine." And there it is again, that tension. Beauty in this world was never just about appearance. It was constantly braided with morality. A beautiful woman, people believed, should also be virtuous, silent, obedient. If she failed at that, if her beauty drew desire or distraction, then she was to blame. And yet here in this small act of writing, you see a kind of resistance. She isn't rejecting beauty, she's reclaiming it, asking to be seen by a different kind of eye. Not that of her suitor or her priest or even her mirror, but of something higher, something gentler. You walk slowly around the room, eyes tracing the shelves of books, some bound in leather, some in plain cloth. These aren't books about beauty. These are books of beauty. Psalters with vines curling around golden letters. herbal manuscripts with delicate sketches of flowers and fruits, books of hours with saints painted so tenderly they seemed to breathe. And you realize suddenly that beauty wasn't just seen in women, it was made by them. Their hands bound these books, mixed the pigments, ground the ink, embroidered the bookmarks. The labor of women, often invisible, was everywhere. It was in the altar cloth that caught the light just so during a mass. It was in the carefully mixed perfume of rose and musk that a bride dabbed behind her ears. It was in the apple pie crust, shaped like petals for a harvest feast. Medieval women, restricted though they were, created beauty constantly. They created it with what little they had, scraps of thread, broken herbs, candle stubs, and often it wasn't for recognition. It was for care, for others, for community, for God, or simply for the small, quiet satisfaction of making something lovely in a hard, cold world. You step out into the night again and pause beside a carved stone statue of the Virgin Mary. Her face is calm, expressionless, her hands folded in prayer. For centuries, she was the ultimate ideal, modest, chaste, ethereal. But she was also untouchable. No woman could live up to her and remain human. And yet every woman was compared to her anyway. You think of all the other ideals too. The goddess-like figures of medieval romance, Isolde Guinevere, the Lady of the Lake. Always beautiful, always tragic, always more symbol than person. These characters shaped expectations for real women who were expected to embody impossible traits, innocence, and experience modesty and allure, beauty, and silence. But not all women conformed. Some shaped their eyebrows differently. Some wore red when they were told to wear white. Some spoke too much. Some didn't marry at all. And in their quiet choices, their little rebellions, they made room for a broader kind of beauty, one that didn't need to be painted or praised, just lived. You're beginning to see clearly now in medieval times. Beauty was a kind of performance, but also a private act of resilience. A woman could be beautiful in a feast hall, surrounded by admiring glances. But she could also be beautiful kneeling in a garden at dawn, or wiping a child's nose, or sitting in stillness with grief folded into her lap. Beauty lived in the doing, in a well-timed joke, in the bravery of a widow taking over her husband's estate, in the hush of a girl offering bread to a stranger. It wasn't always noticed, but it mattered. It held the fabric of the world together. And perhaps you think as you walk beneath the stars, that's what made it most beautiful of all. Not the face that was painted, but the hands that wove the frame. You leave the scriptorium behind, stepping into the open night once more. The air carries the scent of damp earth and lavender. The sky above you, heavy with stars, stretches like a velvet ceiling. And now, as you near the end of your journey through this world, you start to realize the more you've seen, the harder it is to define what a beautiful woman truly looked like in medieval times. That's because beauty wasn't a single image. It was a mosaic. You walk past the stables where a girl finishes brushing down a horse. Her sleeves are rolled, her hair frayed from the braid that once held it back. Her freckles glow in the moonlight, and her grin, sudden, lopsided, and free, catches you off guard. She's not noble. She's not refined. But she glows with life. The kind of beauty that never makes it into books, but lingers in memory like a favorite song. And that's something the medieval world rarely admitted, beauty that wasn't performed. Beauty that just existed, unshaped by society, unsought and unforced. But while such beauty bloomed quietly, the ideals continued to roar. You pass a small hall where tapestries hang depicting famous courtships, the knight and the lady, the poet and the muse, the king and his chosen bride. The women in these woven images all look the same, willowy pale, delicate, untouched. They are expressions of longing more than people. Their beauty doesn't evolve. It doesn't wrinkle. It doesn't cry. And yet somewhere not far from here, a midwife is sitting by candlelight with aching hands and blood on her apron. She's delivered a child tonight. She's comforted a mother. She's changed the course of a family's future. No one sings of her. No one paints her. But her beauty fills the room like warmth from a hidden hearth. You walk onward, tracing the outer wall of the manor. You see lovers' initials scratched into the stones, a daisy tucked into a crack in the mortar, a scarf forgotten on a gatepost. Each one speaks of a story of a woman once desired, once adored, perhaps once wept for. And you wonder how many lives are remembered only this way, in scraps, in symbols, in gestures that never made it to the page. You think now of the women who didn't fit the ideals, who were too bold, too dark, too loud, too lean, too thick, too clever, too poor. They were often dismissed in the literature, labeled as scolds, witches, temptresses, or fools, but in life they were the ones who often endured, who carried villages through famine, who remembered the old songs, who taught their daughters to survive. You realize beauty in medieval times was both armor and trap. It could elevate a woman to the highest halls of power or reduce her to silence in a moment. It could win her favor or blame. It could be protection or punishment. Every glance she received came with expectations attached. And yet, despite it all, medieval women carved out their own definitions. In secret smiles, in unspoken courage, in shared laughter between sisters behind a market stall, in the choice to plant mint in the garden, not for display, but for healing, in the decision to love someone unsuitable, or to remain unmarried, or to write their own stories in the margins of books no one else thought they'd ever read. You pause now at the edge of a stone bridge. Beneath it, a slow stream reflects the stars. You lean over and see your reflection, not as you are now, but as a shadow, like the women you've followed all night. Not fully visible, not fully known. And you understand that the truest form of medieval beauty may never have been what the world described. It was what the women gave themselves, their small joys, their defiance, their kindnesses when no one was looking, their strength when no one praised them for it, their willingness to keep living, loving, creating, despite the weight of ideals that so often ignored their full selves. You cross the bridge slowly, leaving the manor behind you. The bells in the chapel tower begin to toll for the final prayers of the day. Somewhere a window creaks open. Somewhere else a baby stirs, and in every corner of this medieval world, beauty lingers. Not in the portraits, but in the lives that couldn't be painted. The path winds now through the fields beyond the manor, where the world is quiet and open, and the sky spills across the earth like ink. You walk slowly, as if retracing the steps of every woman you've seen tonight. And in this calm, under the hush of stars and the rustle of wind through wheat, you begin to understand medieval beauty wasn't about perfection. It was about belonging. You come upon a shepherd's hut at the edge of the fields. Inside, a girl barely past girlhood tends to a small fire. Her face is weathered by the sun, her feet bare, her dress patched at the knees. There's nothing aristocratic about her. No jewels, no veil, no manicured grace. But she moves with certainty, turning the bread over the coals, adding herbs to the pot without measuring, humming a song you can't name but feel like you've known forever. And you realize in this ordinary flickering moment that beauty lived in function, in confidence, in the knowledge of one's place in the world, not in the sense of social rank, but in rhythm, in usefulness, in presence. The medieval world may have idolized certain kinds of beauty, those of courtly ladies, painted saints, and tragic heroines, but it could not survive without women like this one. Her value was not debated in salons or sung about by troubadours, but it was felt. In every bite of bread, in every warm blanket, in every life she quietly sustained. You walk on drawn by the dim glow of a small village where windows spill candlelight onto the dirt roads. You see silhouettes inside homes, women mending clothes, cradling babies, plucking chickens. These are not glamorous acts, but they are acts of care, acts of continuation. And in a world shaped by war, disease, hunger, and prayer, the women who kept things going were the pillars of quiet beauty. One woman opens her door and steps out to pour water for a stray cat. Her hair is streaked with gray. Her back is slightly stooped, but she carries herself with a certain softness, a certain calm. Her eyes are tired but kind, and in her face you see a different kind of beauty, a beauty earned. This was something medieval culture struggled to express. Youth was praised, yes, but there was also room just barely for admiration of endurance. A woman who lived long enough to be a grandmother, who survived childbirth, plague, famine, and war, was sometimes given reverence. The beauty in her face was not in its symmetry, but in its history. And even those considered past their prime often found ways to define their own worth. A widow who knew how to manage a household, a midwife who'd seen 100 births, a healer who knew which roots stopped bleeding. Their beauty wasn't about ornament. It was about authority earned not through inheritance, but through lived experience. You pass the village church now locked for the night. The last candle flickers in a window above the altar. You think of the sermons preached here of sin and modesty and virtue, and how so many women shaped their lives to fit those messages. How they tried to be quiet, pure, obedient. How they were praised for these things. How they were also diminished by them. And yet they still found ways to be themselves. Not by tearing down the walls, but by growing through the cracks. By loving who they weren't supposed to love. By laughing when they weren't supposed to laugh. By planting joy where sorrow was expected. You round a corner and see an older woman leaning out her window to braid her granddaughter's hair. The girl chatters as the woman works, and though you can't hear the words, you recognize the intimacy. The girl will remember this, not just the braid, but the touch, the woman's fingers, the sound of her breath, the warmth of being seen, attended to. Because in the end, beauty was never really about being looked at. It was about being known, being held in memory, being felt in the spaces you touched and the people you changed. You look up now. The sky is wide, the stars countless. You think of all the women whose names were never written down, whose portraits were never painted, who didn't fit the molds and didn't want to, who laughed too loudly, who loved too deeply, who worked too hard and prayed too little, or prayed too much and spoke too often. They weren't ideals, they were real. And that's what makes them beautiful. The night is nearly over now. A pale light creeps along the horizon, brushing the tops of the trees in silver and fading the stars one by one. You find yourself walking back toward the manor, your footsteps slower, heavier, not with fatigue, but with reflection. This place, this time, these women, they've left something with you. Not just images, but impressions. Understandings that didn't arrive all at once but settled gently like dust on candle wax. You pause by the orchard where dew clings to the grass and a cool mist rises. The world feels suspended, poised between night and morning. And as you stand there, you realize that everything you've witnessed, every fragment of beauty, every flash of defiance, every ritual, every whisper, has reshaped your idea of what it meant to be a beautiful woman in medieval times. There was never just one answer. You remember the noblewoman who walked like a hymn, trained to glide, to speak softly, to disappear behind veils of grace and expectation. You remember the servant girl who laughed with her whole body, who let her joy spill freely into the world, regardless of whether it fit into anyone's ideal. You remember the mother brushing her daughter's hair in silence, the old widow humming over her herbs, the peasant girl planting mint beside the kitchen door. You remember them all. And now, in this final hour, the truth is clear. Medieval beauty wasn't a checklist. It wasn't blonde hair or high foreheads or delicate hands or rosewater breath. It was context. It was survival. It was expression. Sometimes it was curated with care. Sometimes it bloomed in defiance. Sometimes it obeyed. Sometimes it rebelled. But always it meant something to someone. In a world governed by faith, by duty, by hierarchy, beauty could be both sanctuary and prison. It could elevate a woman to a queen's throne or trap her behind a convent's walls. It could make her powerful or vulnerable. It could inspire a song or ignite suspicion. And yet, medieval women did not exist only as reflections of male desire or divine archetypes. They created beauty in kitchens, in chapels, in gardens, on battlefields, in books. They spun it, sung it, stitched it, whispered it into children's ears. They defined it in secret ways, ways we will never fully recover, but can almost hear in the silence of these old stones. You reach the edge of the manor one last time. The chapel bell rings once, twice, marking the arrival of a new day. Somewhere a rooster crows. Windows creak open. Life begins again. And as you turn to go, one thought lingers. Beauty in the medieval world wasn't just about being seen. It was about being remembered. It was in the scent someone associated with you, the warmth you left in a room, the look in your eyes that said, "I see you too." And that is why, even centuries later, we still search for them. Not the ideals, but the women themselves. The ones who lived quietly and fiercely just beyond the edges of the page. And now, as the dawn rises gently across the fields of history, it's time to let go. You've walked through corridors of flickering torchlight and gardens filled with dew, glimpsed women whose names were never written down, and listened to the thousand ways beauty shaped and was shaped by the world they lived in. The echoes of their footsteps fade, their whispers soften, and the night finally begins to settle in your bones. Wherever you are, wherever you're listening from, know this history isn't just names and dates and wars. It's people. It's presence. It's the hush of a girl in a linen veil kneeling in the chapel. It's the hands of a midwife steady under pressure. It's the lullabies, the laughter, the scent of lavender tucked into sleeves. These are the truths we don't always find in textbooks, but they live on in us, in our questions, in our remembering. So now close your eyes. Let the last candle flicker out in the manor hall. Let the stars fade behind the soft gray sky. Let the voices fall silent, not in forgetting, but in rest. You've been traveling through time, but your breath is still here, in this moment. Safe, soft, slow. Let it deepen. Let your shoulders ease, your jaw unclench. Your thoughts float gently away like petals on a stream. You are warm. You are safe. You are held in the arms of sleep just as those women were held by the fabric of the world they shaped even when it tried to shape them. Good night, traveler.